think I mostly think of myself as a teacher of elementary school students. So when I speak, just know that's the lens I'm kind of through most of it.
Yeah, when we sort of define ourselves as teachers, I'm at a point where I define myself as a primary teacher, having taught across the grade levels at elementary, but I've spent the last 8 years in K&1. And Dahlia tends to define herself as an elementary teacher, and then Lauren as a high school teacher. So it was kind of interesting for us. None of us have ever taught together. We got to know each other through the writing project, which was kind of exciting, and it's been wonderful. I think, I don't know how many of you have colleagues that are a great match for you, but I think oftentimes we find those great matches for ourselves professionally elsewhere and not always in our own buildings, and that is definitely true for the three of us. So we kind of want to know who you are, and we're a small enough group that if you don't mind, just take a moment and tell us your name and what you do that brought you to Educon, I guess, because what you do may or may not be, your job may or may not be your interest in being here. Let me start over here.
I'm Bruce Builder. I was a computer teacher in K through 8. Now I work for the Office of Education Department or Education Technology in the schools program.
And this is my esteemed colleague. I'm Tracy McGrath. I also, like the three of you, I have a very diverse background in elementary. I had a second grade teacher for many years, taught computers. Now I'm a technology program specialist and also teaching a course at resource teachers.
My name is Kevin Garcia. Intern at
Hi, I'm Will Ehrenfeld. I'm a former high school history teacher, and now I manage a partnership that IBM has with a weird, bizarre, unique school that runs from grades 9 to 14 in Brooklyn, New York.
Hi, I'm Joel. I'm also an intern on the Wood at IBM.
Hello, my name is Takia Howard, and I work at the Miami Valley School in Dayton, Ohio, and I'm actually an admin. My background is in higher education. This is my first 8 months in K-12. My title is Director of Community Purpose, and what that means is community outreach, including community services and site.
I'm John Downs, with the Terrence Institute, which is at the University of Vermont, and we work with middle schools around Vermont, helping them transition to tech-rich.
My name is Rob, and I come from a school in Minnesota, rec school. And I guess to go back to what you were saying before, I guess I'm interested in how is the difference between where the school is and where we'd like it to be, and how does one get there? And I'm still asking that question with a lot of information.
That is a huge question.
My name is Teresa. I am a high school Spanish teacher at a charter school here in Philadelphia.
My name is Kevin Moore. I am a teacher in the area at Malcolm Prep. I teach 11th and 12th grade math. And what brought me here is I chose to make my own professional development pathway instead of going to an institution.
I'm Christina. I'm a high school English teacher in Chatham, New Jersey, and I'm here because I saw Mimi Rami speak 2 years ago at an English conference, and she totally changed the way I think about teaching. And so I was here last year and I'm back and loving it.
So I don't know this is awesome. Sadness for you this year.
Hi, I'm Raquel Barnesi. I am a school Spanish teacher at the Chicago School.
I'm Henry Dawson. I'm a teacher at Breck School, high school English. I'm also the director of multicultural education.
Hi, Eric Fieldman. I'm a high school special education teacher in Constantine, New Jersey, U.S. history and course in social justice.
I'm Christine Aziz, and I teach students biochem at the Science and Engineering Academy at FEBA. And I'm here because I want to make science relevant to my students. So when I was in undergrad, I did a lot of research work and studies on science for social justice. So yeah, so I want to see how I can integrate my content along with social justice.
I'm Sarah Caswell. I am an SLA parent. I have a daughter graduating this year from Center City, and this one's starting next fall here in Center City. I'm also a high school special education design student in the students from Philadelphia.
I'm here to learn, listen, and grow. My name is Mustafa.
I'm Rizal, and what brought me here is my friends from educator, Melinda, Gian, and Jose right here. We thought it was important to come and talk about student voice and activism.
My name is Jose Wilson, and y'all know why I'm here. I came here because EduCon has become a safe space for me to discuss these critical issues with like-minded folks who actually want to make progress within education, which I can't say is the same as being in New York City.
Yeah, Monica Snelling, and I'm here to find out. Handle these
Hi, my name is Colin Samuel. I'm a technology teacher and technology director at the Greenville School in Brooklyn, Long Island. And I saw you guys were 5 minutes away from where I teach, so this would be a,
I teach at Glencoe.
There you go. So
She said, that's so close.
it's literally 5
Which,
minutes. So.
as one who doesn't know New York at all, I was like, okay, sure. So we're here today to talk about social justice teaching and learning, and that's a phrase or terms that have different meaning to different people, sometimes positive, sometimes less so. We have a document, let me stick I'm not good enough to make a really fascinating bit.ly, so you're stuck with the generated one. But so if you want to kind of have it, look at it, add to it.
Yeah, we want to emphasize you adding to it. These are just things that pop in our minds because it's a troubled term, social justice, and we want to trouble it a little more. So please, if you have resources or ideas, just put them on there because it's definitely a shared collaborative space. And we hope to continue as a shared collaborative space, not just us giving you, throwing out.
So we thought we'd start today by kind of defining social justice teaching and learning. And we've got definitions that came out of literature, but at this point, I think it's something that there's a lot of different meanings for. So as you take a look at this, and they're linked so you know where they came from. If you take a look at it later, there's a definition here from R.D. Duncan. As we stream this out loud, I will admit to a bit of shock to find Duncan discussing social justice.
It should be QAB, not
Oh.
QB.
Thank you.
But I think it's important we have this on here to show that this term has now gotten almost overused, that it's become cliched to say social justice, and that could mean anything. It definitely meant something different 10 years ago and 20 years ago. So, you know, when the Secretary of Education is speaking about something that was at one point counter-narrative and counter-culture type of teaching, that it's become so mainstream that it's important for us to figure out what it means to us, each of us for ourselves.
And I don't know, what do you think? Do you want to hold room for a bit or should we break?
I think small.
Okay, so I think what we'll do for the moment is, we also gave you some resources here, links. But we'd like to kind of think about what do you think, how would you define social justice teaching and learning? And I don't know if you want to be at your table or if you want to be slightly larger than that. But start kind of generating, what does this mean to you? How would you define it? What do you picture in your head when you hear that phrase? You can add that to the doc, or you can just talk amongst yourselves and we can add as we hear things. But let's take 7 or 8 minutes? 7 or 8 minutes to kind of talk about what this means.
I'm sorry, but the doc is showing up as view only to me. Is that happening to other people?
Yeah.
Let me change those settings. I thought I fixed that, but let me work on that while you start chatting.
Okay.
So we're coming up with definition.
Yeah, like how do you
Just introductions, yeah, and then,
what is social justice?
It's hard, but I think in the realm of like guide or California, sometimes usually it's opening up for we could join another.
Either one. We're on a land.
Okay, that's cute. Okay, very cool.
So we're talking about social justice teaching and learning. If that doesn't, if that just broader than school to you, I say go with it. My gut as a teacher is always to not limit. I don't want to narrow. If you're thinking about it.
No, because I think for me, it changes from year to year. That's good though. It would have been something. Well, what you're talking about, I like higher ed. When you feel like, what's the day like, look like? That might be an expensive. That's sort of like
racial divide really complex. Really helped. That was the next thing. I am one of
I think being in a school, I teach a history of organics, and
especially since I
think the acceptance of one another is always because
I try to be honest.
I think that they're doing
and running a sustainability
while I was math, we found
myself and another we found that trying to talk about environment, but it's about is kind of like environmental justice is social justice. Truly, I don't understand what it means, understand recycling, have everything. Why should they? So there's been a group that's every members left against our best effort. I also serve on the Lord Schools and the Elementary Council for 13th and 5th graders, and I advise that to these those kids about the third hour and just racing down lots of energy around that. As the kids get older, they lose it, forget it. I struggle with it. It's a real strong struggle. I came down to this conversation not really wanting to talk about so I only deal with white people. I get to these very discussions on race, and I saw this one, and what caught my eye was that, these were educated by like my work, and I was like, that's
maybe they can help you.
Yeah, so that was kind of where I was like, yeah, definitely make this work somehow. But it's such a, like, I just really, yesterday I was like, social justice is not going to go. I don't care, I care. But I know. We don't have a lot of support at campus to talk about it. Discuss it. Even sort of combat it. It is what it is. Right now, this our school or board is a 5-year diversity plan. It's a 5-year strategic plan. Diversity is one of the pillars, but the deliverable is a diversity statement. Because I can't stand it. If I have to hear about a diversity statement again, I'm going to put it on face. Because their statements don't do anything. It's just put it on your website and like, yeah, we love everybody. And we just, we're done. We move on. Yeah, pretty much. So, how? Help.
I'm wondering if here's, not that it's sharing your topics, but like, here's the fight for and it's not because there's just another form of oppression. I'm pushing my agenda onto kids. Like, I'm that but it's other. I'm like, but like learning how
yeah. And so that's my part is you're learning
how they were. What's our role in this? I think
And there's a program in Philly called Media partners with it. It's this nonprofit organization that has so like they sit and they have like a parking lot discussion where they talk about the topics that are most important to them. So last year, I was like, really
weird stuff with me. One of the ways I justify what I do. It's like, I mean, I could get up and go to work and now I did nothing. I used to be like and sometimes it's like wonderful meetings and a lot of faculty campus who do trust, but the overwhelming sort of collective
Well, that's.
I wasn't afraid that I was going to
how to allow students to control the conversation and step back myself when it comes to those topics. There's so many variations in my classroom and I love it. You just said, you should don't say that. And then another kid is just fired up.
I don't know if any of you were in, I believe Chris Lehman mentioned in his session yesterday. But it was interesting. I saw someone tweet about it. Like, I first learned it from Christian Long, one of my the phrase of yes. Instead of having a conversation with yes, that's true, but you immediately shut down that person's perspective. How could you turn it to yes? Oh, yes. And I think this is also true. I think this is another way to work out. It's a company, and they go in and so it looks like Christian Long and Trump fantastic guys. And they really work with design thinking. Give you a perspective. A learning and design expedition. I would definitely look them up. So they came into Malvern and we ran a 3D session where it was just our faculty and we first started off by building an intro Lego face that discuss who we are, that kind of represent who we are.
You guys would be the ones that would bring it. So,
And then we get to do five, I think it's 5 question session at once. And we have to design and build this for that person.
And this is my least favorite part of the
We haven't filled out, we just talked about it. Better talk about it, I guess. Before sort of discussing why.
But making you stop talking is what I'm gonna do.
Why we're here.
I don't like it, but I'll do it. There are definitely some things being added to the Google Doc, so thank you for that. If you've been putting some things in there.
Yeah.
I had to run against you. For me, I had to run over and add something. I'm like, I will forget what I'm hearing, and if I don't write it down, and then later I'll be like, but there was a really great idea. So there's some thoughts here about social justice teaching and learning. I think one of the big themes you see both in our conversations here and in the publications and writings about it is that it involves change. The idea of making change within the context of your own community or conceivably even broader. But so if you kind of want to just take a look and see the kinds of things people are talking about: equity, looking past the bigger picture, collective action, making informed decisions, so having enough knowledge to make an informed decision. Wow, as we head into an election year, that would be delightful. And then, does it look different with different populations? Rob was talking about his students and being in an independent school that has resources, and how for him, as he thinks about this, is the idea of how do we ensure that others have access to resources. And is that, tell me if I'm paraphrasing poorly. Whereas I teach in a school that's high poverty, high immigrant. My students don't, my school has resources because I teach in a very wealthy county, but in the second poorest school out of 200 plus schools in my county. My students themselves and their families do not have resources and access. And I think, wow, how different does it look in my daughter's school 3 miles away and my school? What is social, is there a difference in what I'm thinking when I think social justice teaching and learning in those two instances?
And more interesting is in your school, do your students even realize that there is a social justice issue and that there is a difference between those two schools?
So that, tell me your name again.
Sarah.
Sarah. Listening to Sarah a little bit ago, talking about the difference between her neighborhood and the neighborhood in which she teaches, and how her students, and how old are your students?
They're high school.
Oh my God, I really thought they were younger for that conversation. How her high school students completely assume that the reality of their neighborhood is the reality of every neighborhood. And so I began to wonder how much of this is helping students see. I think frequently about my responsibility of helping ensure that my own personal children realize that not everyone lives like them.
Well, I think one of the things with Philadelphia in particular is Philadelphia is a city of neighborhoods. And it is, you are from a neighborhood, that is your hood, that is where you are born and raised, and grandma lives 2 houses up. And so many of our students have never left the neighborhood in which they were born and raised. And so it's not out of the norm. And what do they see on the news? They see their neighborhood on the news. So they just assume that
that's what everything is, of course.
That the world centers around that.
Oh, that's fascinating, because I work with high school students in Harlem now, and I'm heartbroken but happy. It's this weird feeling where you're happy people are aware of things because you don't want people to kind of be blindsided, but at the same time, there's a lot of pain, and they are so hyper aware of the inequities in New York City, and they will say, I have to commute an hour to go to a school that's crappy. How come schools on TV have debate teams? I'd love to be on a debate team. How come our teachers leave halfway through the year? That doesn't happen at other schools. And it's so, like, it makes me curious why in some situations kids are so aware and students are so aware of the inequities, and other times there's an assumption that everything is like them. And I don't know if they tell their teachers this, because I work with them in like a youth historians program after school, so it might be an easier way to tell someone because I'm
But
not their
also think
teacher.
about your kids are seeing New York on the news, and New York is Manhattan on the news. And so what's portrayed on TV there
And I think all
is
comes
very
from TV,
different
yes.
than what's portrayed here, like in Philadelphia. We're not like a newsworthy town other than what happens locally, and so they see the gun violence or the home invasions or whatever, and it's their neighborhood. So I think it's the portrayal by the media
Isn't that
of two
amazing?
very different worlds.
I also wonder if the fact that your students commute and therefore
That's what I was
travel
thinking, too.
across the city, they see, whereas if you go to your neighborhood school and that's, you stay
Right.
within your neighborhood, that changes your perspective. But it's this is not the first I've thought about social justice teaching and learning, and yet it's the first time I think where I've thought, I've always assumed that my students, my 5-year-olds, recognize that their life is different than my own children. And now I think you're right, I don't think they do. And how much I have to shift my lens now to think about what is my role in helping them understand the world around them. It's not what I thought it was.
Our students, it's a wealthy community in that it being a private school, and we try to think about how can we engage them in seeing the world outside of our school at an earlier age. Their junior year, they're required to go on a 10-day service trip to a third world country. And it's not until then that they really see something outside. So now we started to engage them in their sophomore year. They have to go to Camden for 4 days. And they start to go, their freshman year now, they have a 1-day trip to another neighborhood. It's interesting to hear their reflections on what it's like outside of Malvern and their campus.
Right, how powerful too. When you said they go to a third world country, I thought, but then do they have any idea how different it is here in their own country? So
Yeah.
sending them to Camden,
Yeah.
suddenly it's much closer to home.
But does it also fetishize or like I mean like being Egyptian African? There's always this perception of Africa as one thing, and it's always poor and it's always sad. And I kind of wonder when we take. And I'm wondering, like, I think it's like an amazing thing to experience, but how do we do it responsibly so they don't come back like, oh, those poor, it's like the Peace Corps mentality, those poor people in those other countries and they need us. How do we do it in a way that's, because I do think it's important, but I always struggle with that for myself, even with like kids in my own life personally, like how do we do it in a responsible way that they see the value and the love and the riches of other places as well as the challenges.
Right, and the dignity and without it becoming, okay, you wanted to. And then Tasmin.
There's critical race theory that steps, critical social justice theory that steps a little bit beyond. Because when you had started, you were saying that you had collective frustration with the term, and that might be a little bit much for younger kids. But interrogating whose benefit is it for these kinds of attitudes to persist, and these kinds of lacks of resources to persist, getting underneath, it's the action as well, but looking at why we collectively see Africa as a country quite often in the media, why we, and not to push the point, but why we think in terms of hierarchies, first world, second world, third world. Why do we persist in that kind of, so getting underneath the way we talk about these issues, I think and involving students in that as well.
In those conversations. Tasmin, do you want to say something?
I was gonna touch on the deficit perspective. And then I did it, so then I can just type it.
Thank you for typing. And you.
There's a number of schools that like to have to sponsor trips to third world countries, and this day and age when income inequality is what it is, how come they're not on trips to places in your own country, your own environment? I always hear that and it drives me insane because here I am at a conference talking to a person who works 5 minutes from me, who has a problem that I don't have. And I think part of what you do when you go to a third world country is you go there, you see a problem, and then you distance yourself from it. You never see it again. And then, it'd be nice to get into a situation where you have a conversation and a continued sort of relationship with a social justice, sort of project instead of this like, well, we'll do it once and it's like the soup kitchen mentality. I hate
Yes,
it.
I know.
Volunteerism. Where we can make ourselves feel good, but not actually.
Yeah, you're doing it for you, but not
We're
for
not
them.
impacting the status quo in any way.
Will?
Yeah, so I think a lot about I can't remember the author, but a text I read when I started teaching called Books Like Clothes. And it talks about how students sort of only accept and read and get into books that they can sort of see themselves wearing, right? And I mean, you see this on the New York City subway all the time. People will show off their books. And will, you know, Joel started a conversation on the train the other day because he had The Alchemist out and started talking to someone else with a similar book, the same book. And I think about that in terms of service trips. So I went to one of these overpriced sort of elite colleges. I'll call it Tufts University. I have lots of mixed feelings about it, but I'm not shy, right? And so, please do, yeah. At Tufts University, and I'm at Will Ehrenfeld. I have no problem. They're not getting any of my money after I pay off my student loans anyway. But students there overwhelmingly wear these like service trips like clothes.
Yes.
And they come back and say, I was in Haiti for 2 weeks after the earthquake, so I'm a social justice warrior.
Yes.
And I personally myself went on a fully funded trip to Rwanda after I graduated because it's a free trip to Rwanda. And I can't imagine anyone turning that down if you have these interests and you're curious about it. And we went to a private school with a gate around it and watched kids line up outside the gate when we handed out the sneakers that we brought from the United States. And I have never been more uncomfortable in my life than watching these kids who look just like the kids on the inside of the school, and they have some complicated admissions criteria, I'm sure, that they call equitable. But what is that? That's not social justice, even though it's a really good thing for the kids on the inside of the gate. They were getting a great education. They got to meet American students coming to visit them all the time and bully for them. But I don't understand how someone can invest their money and their time in a program like that, that literally fences off half the population, more than
At least, yeah.
And so, just in case anyone's curious, I work in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, one of the poorest communities in New York City.
I grew up in Crown Heights.
Nice. If you want to come visit, and actually it's gentrifying very quickly, not the poorest anymore, District 17 in New York City, if you want to come for a service trip to see the hood in New York City, we'll host you, we'll show you around, feel free.
Miss Crown Heights, I really do.
And so I think people do that because it's making themselves feel good. Because they can check off another box, you know, and it's riding in on, excuse the pun, the white horse, you know, and then I've done my job and now I can sit back and let someone else do it because I've done my
Better
job.
banker after that.
One of the things that we wanted to take a little bit of time to do today was to share some of our own experiences with social justice teaching and learning. And I'm going to start by saying that I don't think I'm doing it well. And the realization I came to from Sarah's conversation earlier has just reinforced my sense that I'm not doing it well. But I do teach 5 and 6 year olds, and I do teach a very high immigrant population. They are brilliant children. They speak at least 2 languages, if not more. And how on earth we see that as a deficit rather than something to celebrate and encourage, I will never understand. But my greatest goal when it comes to being a teacher and thinking about social justice teaching and learning for my 5 and 6 year olds is about threefold now. It was twofold and now it's threefold. One is to listen to them. And one of the things that we talked about as we were preparing for this was this sense that often students who, and actually I should let you share this. Often students who went to schools with a strong social justice component, if you speak to them later, they'll go, oh yeah, that's what the teacher wanted. These often were not projects in which they felt invested. They were projects and activism in which the teachers felt strongly, and so the students were swept up in it, and it wasn't something that had been their passion. So one of my greatest goals is to listen to my students to figure out what they care about. They're 5 and 6. They're not exactly worked up over the kinds of things that are working me up. I'm okay with that. They may be worked up because they're kindergartners and they don't get to do the things that the 1st through 6th graders do. Great, let's have that conversation. If my students can identify a way in which things are not equitable for them, that they care about, and learn to take action, then I don't care what it is. If it's solely that they can't go to the library by themselves and everybody else in the school can go to the library by themselves, then that's an issue we can address. So that's one thing I do, is try to just really listen to the things that they are talking about and caring about. The second thing I try to do is think very consciously about the choice of literature I read to them. I have been a teacher for 18 years. It is shameful to me to look back on my first decade of teaching and realized that while I have always taught students who do not look like me, the books I shared with them often reflected me. So that has become a huge goal of mine, to read my students books in which they can see themselves. Not solely about famous people that they can, we did just read about Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. because we had the holiday and this is a good time to have this conversation. And we read My Brother Martin, and we read Martin's Big Words, and we read Rosa by Nikki Giovanni, and we read some wonderful books. Great, I'm not against that, but I also want to just read them books about kids who look like them, the kinds of books that kids read, but where their children are not always white. I want them to recognize that the world reflects them as well. And now my third goal is going to be to help them recognize that not everyone's world looks like their world, for better or worse. And so we're gonna have to start engaging in those conversations. Before you guys share, did you want to say something?
I had a question about that. So, I mean, it's great that you're critically thinking about the text you have for your curriculum, but are you the person who's making the decision of what books the kids are reading? Because I feel like it's very, I mean, I'm not trying to judge you, but it's very easy to assume who the kids identify with, you know?
Yes. My goal is not, my goal is to have a widely diverse collection of books for them.
Yeah.
I don't have a clue what they're going to look for. But I don't want the books that I offer them to all either be animals, which when you're talking about 5 and 6 year olds is often true, talking animals, or white children. I want them to see, and I have added a ridiculous number of books to my library in the last 2 years in order to have Latino children, Black children, Asian children, Middle Eastern children, I want them to see everyone. But I'm sure that I'm still not doing. It's never going to be as much as I'd like it to be. Right. It's always going to be a work in progress, especially because this has not been something children's publishing has done well. So as children's publishing gets better at it, I can continue to get better at it. So those are kind of my goals as a teacher of very young children. Should we go up at the age or?
Okay, sure. So I'm going to just tell you a few of my assumptions, my biases, my history, because I think it's important as educators that we're open with them and who we are, and that way you can take what I say with a grain of salt, or you understand the kind of the lens the world I come from, so that everything I say comes through that lens, as opposed to just kind of these statements I make and then here I am as a person. So I grew up in a really radical tradition that education, so my family's from Egypt and they went to school under post-colonial rule and post-colonial rule. And that's a big part. And I come from a big family of educators. And that was a big part, that education can be used to oppress and maintain status quo, that education can also be used to uproot and disrupt it. So it's important that I say that sometimes, that's who I am, and that everything I teach every day comes from that kind of upbringing. I also went to Cal, Berkeley, and Teachers College. So 2 places were kind of the radical protests, and you'll see how that was part of who I was growing up. I'm going to change the world, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do human rights law, and I actually did criminal justice and prison work with female inmates, and I got into education because I worked with their children. That was my whole thesis, was how does the war on drugs and prison and mass incarceration in our country impact children? And I fell in love with kids. I never would have thought I'd be a teacher, I never imagined it, but I went into teaching kind of in this roundabout way. So teaching for me was always a justice issue, and how do we disrupt the way the status quo works? So I started teaching different grades, but the big things for me and the big ahas realization, and I think Jenny touched upon this, if you ever think you've got it, or if you're comfortable, you're not doing social justice. I think you have to constantly be faced with your own biases, your own prejudices, your own complicity in the system. I think because I don't think in our lifetime, I wish the world will be amazing and wonderful and full of everything, but I think that's a big thing, is to constantly check our own biases and our own assumptions. Yes, I'm a woman of color. I recognize that when I lived in Crown Heights, I was part of the gentrification problem. Same thing when I lived in Arlington. I was part of the gentrification problem. And this is right outside DC. So I think just owning who we are has been a big thing. And it's a brutal look in the mirror we were talking about, because I think I came out of school I'm doing this, very Angela Davis poster up, and I'm ready to take on this work. And I'm like, oh, I do some awful things. And I have to own it. And the second part is kind of thinking about what social justice versus social action. And I think I started with social justice, moved into social action, how do we act upon this? But we talked about this, it can't be about my agenda. And it was for the first few years of my teaching. The issues I thought were important. Maybe I never said this is what we're going to do, But I, as a teacher, we hold that privilege of what comes in the class for a while, right? And I know that whatever I say is going to have value because I'm the grown-up, especially in elementary school setting, I think, where they still kind of, I love my teacher. So becoming aware of not pushing my agenda and helping them develop their voice. So my two things that I always think, if I can work on this for every kid, is how do we help them see and hear and feel that they have a voice and who they are. I think self-discovery and understanding oneself and who we are as people. And then how does being that individual belong as being part of a bigger community? And I kind of approach everything in my teaching, from the science to the math to literacy, through those two things: getting to know oneself and then getting to understand how we fit into a part of the community. That's me for now. Pardon me.
So my experience is quite different from theirs, because by the time I get them, they have big voices, right? Because I teach high school English.
Or no voice.
Or no voice, because so the interesting thing that's happened in the community that I'm in now, I'm actually teaching at the high school where I went 20 years ago. And so it's interesting to see the change that has happened. One of the greatest disservices that have been done to those students is they are super duper insular. So they don't understand. I'm on Long Island, so I was kind of chuckling to myself when you were talking about your experience with your students, because they think the way that their world is the way that the world is for New York. And they're on the North Shore of Long Island, and there is a lot of money there. There might be diversity in my school, but there's a complete lack of communication between those communities, and it starts with the tracking, right? I teach honors and I teach non-honors, and the classes look quite different. Right, you might have one, African American child, or one, Asian child, or one, but they feel alone in those classes. And a lot of my students either don't feel like they have a voice, or they think everything's just fine. And so, what's the problem, right? And so, I feel slightly isolated in my school just because there isn't a lot of communication between teachers, and that's more of a systemic problem in the district. But what I can do as an English teacher is I can use what they're reading, and I can use writing to give them a voice. And so the first thing that I've been able to do, and of course there's so much work that I still have to do, but balancing the curriculum. So standard English 11, The Great Gatsby. Okay, a bunch of kids that are living in an underprivileged area of my town don't give a shit about the Great Gatsby, and they can't relate. And so what am I doing? I put Persepolis in it, right? Females need to be represented. Maybe kids' interest in graphic novels, even something as simple as that. Give student interest and student choice, and asking them did you, after we're done with the unit, reflecting? And it's funny because when I ask them to reflect, they're really, really nervous to do that, because what if they step on my toes and say, you know what, I kind of hated that book and I don't want to read it again. And she's gonna be pissed if I say that. So you have to gain trust, right, from the kids. And I think it spends so much time. The first thing that you can do, I think, as far as social justice with education is concerned, is build a community, right? Allow them to feel like they can say, I didn't like this book and this is why. Or I did like this book and this is why, right? I mean, I was shocked when I taught Persepolis for the first time to hear so many kids say, I didn't realize there were human rights issues happening in X, Y, and Z location. And to me, that was a crime. And so it was a reason to keep that in the curriculum. Just things as simple as, and this is not anything revolutionary, like Socratic seminar. Why am I talking all the time about reading? But that also requires that they learn how to ask questions. And so how do you teach them to ask questions? And it isn't about giving them the voice, it's honoring it. And actually I think that's so important, because so many of them just they have been trained to not share it. And so it takes a long, long time. I mean, we're in February almost, and I'm just now getting my kids to open up. It's hard work. And the other thing that I try to do is bridge the community through writing. So I have my kids go out to the community and interview people in the community, and then bring the people from the community back in and share the writing that they've done, to see that there's issues in their immediate vicinity that they don't know about, because they're so narrow-minded in their own school situation. Yeah, because they're teenagers, right?
So I just realized this is very typical of me. I just told you random things about myself. I didn't really talk about what I did in my classroom at all. I'm so sorry. It's not because I'm self-centered. It's just I think we need to understand each other, and that way you can decide, I don't want to listen to her because this is heard things, but you were like, oh yeah, I didn't share anything practical at all. So I'm a big believer in community and starting with local community, and I think especially for younger children. Again, because of my background, being from a third world developing country, I always, whenever those issues are taught, because it's always like, oh, look, these poor little people in this country and they don't have anything. And I'm like, we need to get to know our community. And I think that's definitely pushed me. So I go through a big process called community mapping. And this is like the Jane Goodall Institute, which is a lot of work on this of really understanding. So we go out into our community at least 3 days out of the week. We go walk around. And I think I used to do it without telling anyone. And then finally they saw good things happen. And then we got permission. And that honestly is a big part of some of the work we do. There's some level of being subversive in it as much as you can. Now I'm a little older now, so it's easier to say, oh, well, we can like try it, you know? But going out to the community and starting with the resources in our community, and we looked at people, animals, and the environment, and really understanding what are the riches in our community? What are the community services? And looking at it from a person's point of view and from kids' point of view versus adults, and looking at how we were in I'm going to call it an urban suburban hybrid outside of DC. That's the only way I can think of kind of our community is there. We can walk around. There's a main street with lots of shops, but there are still little houses and backyards. And I lived in my school's neighborhood, so a lot of my students were my neighbors. Fun, except when you have to go out in your bathrobe to get something from the car. Then not so fun, but it really helped me just feel grounded in it. But also seeing the community through wealth and resources before we look at the challenges in the community for a couple of reasons. One, we don't have a deficit model about our own community. And children who live in poor areas are bombarded with images of how bad their neighborhood is. Nobody wants to come there. It's scary. Nobody wants to live there. It's dangerous. I think this woman here, Sarah was talking about, like, you know, you only see your neighborhood on TV when there's violence and there's shootings and everything. And it's important
They
to
get
do
those messages from their teachers.
And
I'm
the
astounded
teachers.
how often
Yeah.
teachers are like, yeah, I can't go to a home visit, that's not safe. You teach a 6-year-old who lives there.
I have a black principal who will not allow us to make home visits in our neighborhood because it's not safe.
And there you go. And we think these things don't get communicated.
We are making
Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, in our last PD, our principal told us to go visit the neighborhoods.
Right.
He was like, you're not
To know.
doing your job if you don't know where your kids are coming from.
And
Our
so,
children
if
live
you don't
there.
show up to a parent conference, they will show up at your house. But yet my principal, I pushed and pushed and pushed when I started school in the fall, and he said, I got a lot of pushback to the point where he was like, you need to shut your mouth. But I was like,
Isn't that?
my kids live here.
This is so critical for them
imagine
not
the-
to have a deficit
right,
model of
imagine
their
the
own
message.
world.
The message is constantly, it gets overwhelming. And I think that's why starting with what's valuable, and the kids are, I didn't know this community center was here. Or, I mean, the one for animals is hilarious with third graders, you know, like there's a random place we can put bunnies. There was an obsession with bunnies in our neighborhood, even though the adults hated the bunnies, the kids were all obsessed with the bunnies. But looking at it, so what it does is it allows them to have a positive view. And I've done the community walks, I've done it it was easier in Arlington, but I did it I used to teach at my old elementary school, and it's east of East LA. And it's suburban poverty, for lack of, I really just don't know how. But we walked around, there's still things you can see and resources, but it also develops a love and a nuanced understanding of what's in the community before we looked at the challenges. So once we identified the challenges we saw in our community, they knew who the restaurant owners were that they could work with. They knew what the community services offered. They were like, oh, this is a resource for animals. We can go talk to them when we want to look at urban habitats, or this is the fair housing office. So now when we want to look at how, because our neighborhood was gentrifying, including my husband and I being part of the gentrification, he said, now we can work with this office to talk about it. And then also just making it throughout the curriculum and not, when I started, it was like, here's our unit and we're doing it now. We're now going to do our social justice picture books. Awesome. End of the year, or now we're going to do our big volunteer project. And instead, the last few years, just making it the whole year. So looking at the study of community as the curriculum. And to get on a practical note, almost every standard will fit into it, I promise. Some you have to really squeeze in there. But we looked at math, we looked at the budgets of how much people got paid who worked in our community, Columbia Pike, and then how much housing costs, how much food costs, how much all of that cost, and look, can you survive? Can you live and work in the same community? Science, we looked at the justice issues for animals, we looked at environmental justice, we looked at the nutrition in the restaurants, economics was the restaurant. So these are third graders. And again, it took time and it took thought. It wasn't like overnight. You know, I started with picture books and writing them and all of this. But there are ways, if you look at it through the lens of how can we serve our community, and then take your standards and think, how do you twist the standards to fit the work your kids want to do versus the other way around, it becomes a lot easier.
I also think you said something really important about it not just being like a unit, right? It's like a construct of thinking, and I think it took me a while to kind of get to that, like problematizing everything that we're like reading, everything that we're writing. I think it's like a mental shift, I think. It's not just like, let me check the boxes, I did this like cool social justice unit.
Right. I got pictures in the paper, cool.
And you both hit on this idea that it requires building community and it requires investing time in talking and listening, and so, yeah. Thank you.
You might be interested, there's a couple of sites. One is called Poverty Porn. Because what you're doing in classrooms is wonderful. You can hear the excitement, but you've got this culture outside that's, for whatever reason, persisting in manufacturing and putting certain images in front of us. So poverty porn posits the notion that only some folks who look a particular way are going to be the recipients of our largesse, right? And to your point about Tufts, there is a movement called learning service.